pushing that, I'm gonna put our best foot forward to get that. But what they want to do is they want us to create an exhibit for that. And then she said either that will go up permanently or it could come up every year, like for the next decade, during Nurses Week, which I know we could swing that. I don't think we could swing that.
Yep, powder something all over you.
Okay. Thank you. Anyways, and I was telling her that we're part of the state organization, so I said, if you choose us, it could go to this big, it'll stay here, but if anything ever happened to us.
I forgot. So what do I have to do? Oh, you emailed me, I was busy working on my thing.
Building our Facebook, then I'm not done asking for that shit.
It's too late now? Okay. That's fine. It is what it is.
I know. I know, that's what I'm thinking. I don't know what's usually. No, I didn't.
It's a blackboard eraser thing.
Like, stop it.
We have a better.
I think I'd be driving this vehicle.
That would fix that budget. Yeah. We spend our hours being done. Just to keep you in the loop.
I wanted to sit in front.
Sure.
You can put yourself around to my person. Oh, no, we weren't there.
Because I didn't belong to like the garden.
No.
Some of us we did.
Right. Or society and just different.
Yeah.
Because you were all nice and sewing.
Yeah.
My history,
Yeah.
since I was a little kid.
You were a runner.
So,
I taught myself a lot of really, I didn't get, I just the one that still speaks to you. Embroidering on our jeans and.
yeah, yeah.
And
Jackets.
Yeah.
Yep, I started off, I think, on pieces of sheet. I think my mother cut sheet, we put it in an embroidery thing, and then you draw a picture and then do your cross stitch or whatever.
Good way to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, my mother didn't like embroidery. She did Indian crochet, sewing, different things on material, stuff with me, and stuff like I said, on the couch, she recovered the seats, or she did all that kind of stuff, it wasn't, really happy or, just kind of looked at the embroidery and some of that stuff.
There should be the Ohio
Where they were making something that had to be useful.
Yeah, and it had to be pretty something on the inside.
All right, so you have some. I brought you some too, because I didn't have.
Okay, well, you can leave.
You can leave, don't drink them.
There's,
Sure. Yeah.
They're not.
Thank you.
Just need the size.
Susie's gonna give us some paperwork to take home.
Oh, for the donations, yeah, I need to get forms.
You know, I like to have my hand, I hope Jim didn't toss it. He wouldn't do that.
No, she's like, you won't toss my own stuff.
Oh, he tossed my stuff, not his own
Oh,
stuff,
really?
but he knows better than that, toss my heart now. Do you?
Like, this guy's gonna like draw all over.
Oh, yeah, stickers.
Fantastic, yeah.
Yeah, just different things. They have stickers on yours, or painting or buying something.
Well, when I worked at I was against nuclear plants, and I have on one side of my heart, because it had blue and white, I mean, white with the blue stripes, jam. So on one side, I drew a caution cloud coming out of a power plant, and then I had my room on there. Oh, no, that had headstones in front.
Oh, my.
Down the other side.
I think we could look from Austin.
And he was running for office back then. He says, "Vote Kennedy's put a blonde in the pony."
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah, we still don't know if that even
That's right.
Yeah, right. I just saw the question.
Oh, really? Do they know anything more?
That's awesome. She knew the way it was. She was pregnant, so that was.
Worried about that?
Yep.
Yeah, of a pregnant girlfriend.
Well, are you
Shut up, everything's gone, it's done, it'll disappear.
And nobody's ever talking about, even if he's dead.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
They don't look at.
Is Victoria?
Not at all.
She's in the kitchen with
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did
What's going on?
Victoria start this?
It's already been going, yeah, so
Okay.
we're just wandering
Alright.
around and doing stuff and things.
She's flirting with Shane.
Ooh, yeah. Oops. Just walked right in front of him.
No, I'm good.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this St. Patrick's Day's Eve gathering. We've got some Patty's cookies over there. I'm Brian Bonham. I am the coordinator of the history program and the budget supervisor for this museum. So what we're going to hear tonight is, I guess, kind of an update, a working process report on a research project that's being carried out by pretty much everybody that's going to present tonight. It's titled Women and Work, and it has a subtitle. I've forgotten, what is the subtitle?
Women in the workforce, an interesting story of change and continuity.
Right, and we're looking at change and continuity in women's working conditions in the Valley from basically from the Second World War forward. And there will eventually be an exhibit based on this research. Do we know when that's slated to open?
September 14th.
September 14th. So we hope you will come back and bring many friends with you when we have that ready. I have a few thank yous I'd like to say to the Ohio Humanities for providing a grant that has underwritten a lot of the expense of carrying out this research. There's no one here from them, but I'd also like to thank the Friends for their continuing support and their recent financial gift to us. So our panelists tonight, I'm not sure the order people will be speaking, but Dr. Marcel Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the manager of this facility, and she has a PhD from West Virginia University, right?
Mhm.
And we have Nicole Marino, who will be speaking to you. Nicole is a graduate of YSU's Master's Program in History. And you are the coordinator of outreach, is that your?
I'm the Director of Education and Outreach here.
Education and outreach, okay. And also Susan Lowry, who is here. Susan is also a graduate of YSU's Master's in History program. So without any further ado, as they say, I will pass over to Dr. Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor. Tonight, we're going to talk about a variety of different women and their experiences in the world of work. To do this project, we actually looked at a variety of different sources. There's a bunch of oral histories over at Maud Library. There's also a bunch of women that we've been interviewing who were in the work world between the 1970s through the 2000s. And then we looked at common research or common challenges that people are facing today and that have really come to the forefront of public opinion and public consciousness as a result of the recent COVID epidemic. This is a preliminary presentation of our findings, and it is made possible through the Ohio Humanities Council. It seems that somewhere in time there was a myth that women didn't work outside the home. And I don't know about you guys, but My grandmother worked outside, my mom worked outside. Might be true for some people, but a majority of women throughout history have worked a second shift. And they've done 8 to 12 hours or more on the job, and then after quitting time, they returned home to their families, and they had more responsibilities with childcare and domestic duties. The second shift rarely existed for men. As we discovered recently from the COVID pandemic, many issues that challenged people, both men and women, came to the fore of news reports. And I like to think of these challenges in the workplace as really being for everyone, not just women. They're kind of couched in those, women's terms, but there's a variety of different things that as we hear reports from, especially millennials today, who are complaining about some work-related issues, they're really relevant to everyone. News reports and blogs began reporting the lack of work-life balance, harassment on the job, insufficient childcare, poor wages, discrimination, disrespect in the workplace, and dangers on the job, among many, and a long list of dissatisfactory elements in most working people's lives. For many women, this was not new, and it wasn't news. They've been dealing with and attempting to balance such responsibilities for a long time. Many might say forever. Made me think of the challenges that women working in the 1940s faced. I teach women's studies up at YHCIL, and we deal with a lot of issues that the law has changed and cultural and societal changes have occurred. But there were real challenges if you were in the workplace in the 40s. We also see there's a lot of laws that get passed in the 60s to help eliminate discriminatory practices in society and business. Problem with that is enforcement, getting people on board. And then common problems that women and now more and more men cope with today. While much has changed in the law and society, many of the same problems that our mothers and grandmothers dealt with are still with us today. These ideas inspired us to look into the subject further to determine if there's been any improvement. Because we know there have been legal and social improvements, but what's the reality for women working outside the home? How far have we really come in the past 50 to 70 years in garnering respect, support, and equality on the job? To this end, we looked at a variety of women's experiences, and we wanted to see where there were similarities and differences. These challenges are not necessarily unique to women, but historically have been identified as women's issues or women's problems. And to be fair, these are really human issues. For this grant, we looked at oral histories from our collection as well as those in Maud Library and the website Latino Voices in the Valley. Susan Lowry and Nikki Marino interviewed women of various backgrounds and jobs. We then analyzed our data and compared it with workplace complaints today. And we're just in the early process. I think we've done about 20, 25 oral history interviews. I've looked at about 30. Dr. Bond is actually helping us in looking at some. So we're really early into our stages of finding out what challenges women are really dealing with. And we identified some key words, and I fit them under respect and equality and support, but guilt for leaving your family, leaving children at home. Gender roles, what are the expectations, especially in the workplace and then again at home? Maybe there were transportation issues. This was especially true in the 40s during World War II. And then on and on and on. We hear more today about work-life balance, discrimination, whether it's racial or because you're a woman in a workplace, disrespect, poor pay, flexible work, a variety of different things that are issues. I consulted 31 oral histories so far and have found those reoccurring themes. Whether the women were white, black, immigrant, Catholic, Jewish, young, old. They mentioned a lot of those keywords over and over again. And what we found is many women enjoyed working outside the home. They saw their jobs and responsibilities as giving them a sense of purpose, pride, and accomplishment. Some worked out of necessity. Their wages helped their families and kept food on the table, provided a roof over their head. Others worked for what was called pin money, or when I was interviewing the nurses from the Youngstown General Duty Nurses Association, they called it refrigerator money. So, you know, you wanted to buy a new refrigerator, so you went out and got a job and you worked until you raised the money and then you quit. Whatever its moniker, it amounted to additional income that could be used for luxuries and extras. And I found that being mentioned too. My job really helped us out getting extras for the family. And it brought added stress. Women learned new skills, they worked at a faster pace, especially if they're working inside the factory, and they had to get along with a variety of different people. The women that I researched held a variety of different jobs, from professional positions in nursing and teaching to skilled and unskilled labor in the service industry and factories. These reoccurring themes, whether the women worked in the 40s or the 90s, was lack of respect, lack of support, and equality. When thinking of lack of respect, this was often how the male workers treated women on the job, especially in male-dominated workplaces. Men, unaccustomed to working with women, saw their entry into the field as both a threat and competition. When most people feel threatened, they're going to lash out. And many of the workers did just this, making women's working lives on the job difficult, dangerous, and oppressive. Lisa A. worked at the water department. She was the first woman hired, and when she was hired, it was 1988. And she was still 1988.
88.
Yeah, and she was still the only worker there, or woman worker there. Her male coworkers harassed her. She encountered bias when she was turned down repeatedly for job advancements. Jobs were based on seniority, and it took an Ohio Civil Rights Commission suit for her to be promoted.
Wow.
Yeah. And what I found with a lot of these women too, they're very gutsy, they're willing to stand up for their rights, they're not willing to take the abuse, and they're not willing to quietly just do their job and go home. They're not going to take that. And we're finding that more so as we go on and look at millennials too. Sally C. faced discrimination and lack of respect because she was not only a woman, but she was a Latina, and she was short. She called that her triple whammy. She was studying to become a doctor, but faced opposition at every turn. Instructors called her honey. Her advisor tried to get her to become a nurse instead of a doctor. And one science professor actually told her she didn't belong in the class because she was a woman.
Wow.
And this was in the 90s.
Wow.
This was in the 1990s. Yes. She also had problems when she went to various organizations that were designed to help minorities in medicine because she was a woman. She wasn't dark enough. She was Latina, you know, and so she's facing a variety of different intersectional challenges throughout her attempt to get her job, you know, to be educated. Charmaine E. was a really great character. She worked in a factory. She's a woman of color. And she faced hostility and repeated abuse. Some of her co-workers were racist, but it seems like most of them were misogynists. They just didn't like women. And they would rub up against her. They would touch her backside. One tried to kiss her. When she refused to supervisor's advances and offers of dates, he piled on more work for her. He wouldn't give her breaks that she was entitled to, and he made her work more difficult. Professional jobs also contained a variety of different disrespectful acts. Many of the working nurses faced male doctors who had a God complex. Nurse Linda W. mentioned that when she started working in a hospital in the 1970s, violence on the job was a real thing. If the doctors were angry or frustrated, they would throw stuff at the nurses. It was an old world mentality, is how she phrased it, where the men believed that they were superior to the mere women nurses. This is going to start to change by the 80s. Several of the nurses mentioned education, the fact that they are getting more education themselves, but they're also educating the doctors. And then we start to see more and more men entering the nursing field. And male doctors treat them a lot better, and they were more quickly promoted. Lack of support was the second key theme that I identified when I was looking through it, and we all identified different themes. Pregnancy, childcare, single parent families were issues that reoccurred in the interviews. The nurses often cited they have mandatory overtime where they are forced to work if there's no one to replace them. They can lose their license if they don't stay. And that's really tough on a working woman with children at home. Maybe her husband is also working. Maybe she only has childcare for her shift and no one to go home. Gina S. said this was a real problem because she had a child with a disability. Cindy H., Doris D., and Patty K. echoed this concern as being a primary stressor for them. And I actually had one woman say, we were fighting that in the factory that she worked at with the union. She said, but there were single parent men who had the same problem. So it once again is a universal issue that we can all understand. Men usually didn't feel the burden with the same responsibility unless they were single parents or caring for minor children. Somehow the responsibility seemed to fall on the women's shoulders. And that was another comment that one of the women said, you know, when one of the guys said, I need time off, my daughter needs surgery. And they're like, don't you have a woman to take care of her to do that? They didn't want to give him time off to take care of his daughter. He was a single parent. Deborah E. had to rely on her mother to watch her child when her shift changed to afternoons. Marlene F., a divorced hairdresser, found raising her son alone and working full-time difficult and struggled with the guilt of leaving him so often with babysitters. And I hear that again and again and again. She had been in an abusive relationship and circumstances forced her to work when her son was just an infant. Marty M. and her mother worked at the same factory, but they chose to work different shifts so they could each watch Marty's children. And Marty said that that was one of the biggest problems that women faced when they worked. Bessie S. stated that besides working all day in a factory, many women went home to their home and family responsibilities, stating that there weren't many women active in her union because it isn't that they didn't want to participate, but they didn't have the time. And you're perpetually tired when you're working so many hours. Martha K., another divorced parent, stated that although she worked full-time while her children were young, it was a very difficult period. And I felt torn to ribbons about it all the time. Last thing that I identified was the need for equality. And a lot of these women kept mentioning these issues. Susan A. stated that when she started working, jobs were segregated by gender. And as one of the first females in her cutting area, the men sabotaged her work, put lighter fluid in her flux pots, and acid on her coat. Rose Marie believed that she and her fellow female workers were treated well on the job. Most of the time. That's what she said, most of the time. And that's what we're finding too. It's not all negative. Some places that women work, their bosses stood up for them. Their coworkers were nice people, and they got along well, and they didn't have any problems. As a factory worker in the 70s, this is Rose Marie, we didn't know how the men were going to accept us. To avoid any criticism, Rose Marie would learn the job and be able to do it as well as anyone. We see that theme occurring too. I'm going to do this job so good, they can't say a word. I'm going to do it better than the men so that I can be considered maybe equal. Betty H. loved this interview. She is a minister. She felt the lack of equality in her church, and she eventually would go and change denominations because of that to align with her sense of self. She was a member of the Black Baptist Church, and she felt stymied and believed that their whole conference says that women are not allowed in the pulpit. As a Methodist, she switched to Methodist. She was an associate pastor working with a white male senior pastor. She felt respected and supported by the larger Methodist organization. They actually had programs to help minorities get into the ministerial field, and they provided her with funds for her education. Anna T. claimed that she had 2 strikes against me. I was Italian and Catholic. As a teacher, she endured losing positions to male teachers because the administration wanted a man in the classroom. This is especially true in the elementary grades. She felt the unwritten rules of the 1960s that pertained to women and mentioned that women were second-class citizens and expected to do extra work without extra pay. She said she always had to go to all the faculty meetings, but gee, the male football coach never showed up, you know. When she began her teaching career, male teachers were paid more than their female counterparts. Once the union was voted in, that would all change. So those are my findings so far. And I'm finding that these interviews are just wonderful, and they illustrate how good people can be, as well as real challenges that people have to work with in the workplace. Next, I'd like to introduce Susan Lowry, and she will talk about some of the interviews that she has conducted and her findings thus far. Thank you. Hi.
All right. Okay, so to piggyback off of what Marcel shared about respect, support, and equality, with respect, it's my findings I interviewed 15 ladies in the last couple of months, probably 2.5 months, 2 months. And for respect, it's the sexual misconduct, but there was also verbal abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse. And then there was the discriminations, biases. One of the ladies that I talked to, and particularly like what Marcel was sharing, is the fact that it happens to men and women. She was sharing about how even the men were discriminated because maybe they had strange tattoos and piercings or a different hair color or something like that, and they were singled out and made fun of or something. So she felt like she was a pipe fitter, so she felt as though it wasn't so much that if she was targeted, it wasn't so much that she was a woman, it was just maybe because she was different. But then under support, there was the issues of pregnancy, and also getting support from if you had like an accident at work, they wouldn't get the support they needed from others. And then also support because maybe they suffered violence and discrimination. And then for equality, the advancement opportunities that were missed because they just weren't getting promoted like they should have, and then also the pay gap. So for some of my examples that I have to share, I have 2 of the ladies that were significantly sexually harassed by men by being groped, as opposed to just regular like verbal communication or sexual innuendos. One in particular was she explained how the women's restroom was right next door to the manager's office, and she found 2 peepholes for the manager to look at. And for her, it was all about, what do I do? You know, this was the early 80s. She's in her early 20s. She's not sure what she should do, so she went home, asked a friend or a family member, and they're like, put a poster over it, so that way there's no confrontation. She did, and she went back the next day, and the poster was moved. So then
In the
she,
locker room?
in the women's restroom, and it was just a regular.
Somebody went in and moved the poster.
Away from the peepholes.
Wow.
Yeah, so then this was her manager, her supervisor, went to the next level up, spoke to that gentleman, her concerns and what happened, and literally took him in and said, look, I had a flashlight, and look, you can see right through. What ended up happening is that, okay, they moved the guy, that supervisor, but by doing that, they gave him a promotion. So there was no reprimanding, there was no consequences for his actions.
Peter principle.
Yeah, so, and then the other thing that happened to this same woman is she worked in an oil field where she would have to go to each oil well and investigate, survey, make sure everything's working properly and whatever else stuff they have to do. And I guess they would literally leave naked pictures of random women, whoever they might be, but they would leave her name on it. So she knew it was towards her. And so she'd go off in the country, go to this oil well, and there was this picture with her name on it. So anyways, the other two ladies, there was always some sort of more or less just smaller issues with sexual harassment, basically innuendos and comments. But the one lady, two other ladies, they happened to work at the same restaurant in the 1960s and 70s. And they would be sexually harassing waitresses. At that time, they were called waitresses. And this was along Route 18 and then 224. This was before the interstate was built. So you would have all these truck drivers. But the one, she said, it wasn't so much the truck drivers during the day, it was the overnight guys who maybe have too much to drink. They were the ones that were doing the inappropriate comments and, reaching out, wanting to touch and stuff like that. So, but the one thing that kind of stuck out, again, as being an older generation, being one being an actual baby boomer, one just a few more years later, is the fact that this is how they knew men to be. They were trained that this is how they are. You just deal with it and you keep on working, you keep your head down. And being in that environment too, as a server, you want you want them to come back. So you gotta be nice to them as well. But it was more or less, this is just who they are, and they accepted it. So anyways, so yeah, they learned to shrug it off, and that it was just what they did back then. So these two ladies, but along with the first one and an additional one that I had interviewed, but also then there were some ladies, there was two pipe fitters. The one that was majorly sexually abused, and then another one that's more just the comments. They all, even though they were just a little bit younger, they were more the Generation X generation. They were kind of like, just, you do your job, keep your head down, and you just ignore it, kind of a thing. Whereas it feels as though, the more millennials, they would really want to stand up and make sure that this stuff doesn't happen to them. Let's see here. There was two ladies that who had issues on the job as far as having accidents. One of them was the pipe fitter. She's had several accidents on the job, and when she would come back to work, the individuals would give her a hard time because maybe she at the time was still kind of recuperating, wasn't pulling her weight, but she would always want to prove herself, and she would work 10 times harder to prove herself. And what she did, she ended up being like foreman several times over. In her union, they would always pick her to be the foreman for that day, to keep on working, because they knew she would do the job. The other one that was injured, she was a police officer, was hit by a car, and She didn't, for the most part, all the guys on the force with her, they were fine. There was never any problems. They respected her. But the problem of respecting her was that then they were kind of babying her when she got back. She was 4'11" and just this tiny little lady just, trying to do this job. And in their eyes, this is our job, so you got hurt, you got hit by a car. So, this isn't maybe where you're supposed to be. But she still would try her best to prove herself, but got actually disenchanted with the job. It kind of made her sad. She was also, when she was growing up, she was not raised to be racist at all, but she happened to pull over a gentleman who was African American, and he blamed her for pulling him over for being black, and she's like, no, you were going 15 miles over the speed limit. I'm sorry. And, it was stuff like that that was just one incident that she just happened to share with me, but there was others that she just felt, oh, no, there was one other one. There was young girls under the age of 18 that they were from Michigan, I guess, and traveling through, and caught when they were being trafficked, did I say, yeah, sexually trafficked. So she, had to get involved in that, and that really hurt her feelings too. It was hard for her to deal with that. But what ended up happening, she went into construction instead. She was one of the waitresses, servers, and so she would go back and forth from doing that kind of a job and also working at a grocery store. So she was always happy and content doing those types of jobs. And but she really, if something felt like she wasn't doing something right, she just kept on working harder and harder to prove herself. With that in mind as well, it was her sister that I had interviewed. Same thing. She worked at a fast food restaurant, and she did this to help support her children. She was married. The husband worked at General Motors, and it was all about just wanting to work extra for that refrigerator money. I didn't hear that before. That was interesting. So when you hear about the refrigerator money, that in a sense is what she was doing, but it provided bikes for her kids. And other maybe Christmas toys, what else? To be able to go camp. But when she was working at this fast food restaurant, she worked her way up to be an associate manager and very well respected by the upper management, but the interior managers would sabotage her because she would work so hard and she would go above and beyond that they didn't like it because she was making them look bad. And all they wanted to do was just work and get their paycheck or whatever, just do the bare minimum. So they would make sure that things weren't put back away properly, things would break down and they wouldn't fix it themselves, they would leave it for her to fix. And then even when it got time to some things, they would call somebody and like, oh, such and such is broken. Well, did you call this lady? She'll fix it. And it was always something like that. But all it made her do was just want to work harder. She's like, okay, I'm gonna prove myself that I can do this and they're gonna respect me this way. So half of the time, upper management did respect her, interior managers did not. So that was a problem that she had to deal with. Let me see here. Oh, the pay gap, yeah. So the one who worked in the oil field, early 80s, she's in her early 20s. She worked there, I think it was between 8 and 10 years altogether. And in those years, she always got the bare minimum of pay. She never had the opportunity to advance. She always saw the guys come in getting paid more, and always getting advancement, and she would not. But she stuck with it. She did what she had to do because she had 2 kids. She had to do what she had to do. And that was pretty much something I would always hear about.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Mm. The other pipe fitter, I thought that was interesting then too. She didn't have proper a locker room or a restroom for her. And when she was pregnant, it was hard for her to have moments of privacy to after she had the baby to be able to milk, express, excuse me, I had to think there for a second, what it's called, and, you know, she had to have to go into like a maintenance closet to do it, you know? But she was very thankful. The men that she worked with were very supportive. Some other women didn't always get that. But anyways, when she was 5 months pregnant, she was physically able and capable of being a pipe fitter. She had no problems. She was able to work. The only thing was she was just a little slower. And the second problem was that she had to use the bathroom a little bit more. And well, the one supervisor, the one foreman, gave her crap about it. And so one day he asked her to go do this one job, pick up these things that, they weren't heavy, but they were just bulky, and it was just, and she warned him, okay, yeah, I have no problem doing that. It might take me a little while. And he just went off on her. And then gave the job to another guy, made her feel guilty about the whole situation, and forced her to, in the end, what happened was it forced her to take her leave of absence way earlier than what she wanted to. So that was not a good situation for her, so. But she still loves the job, she loves working with her hands, and she would encourage anybody to do that job, so. And also, then I did interview a total of 3 African Americans. One is in her 80s, one is in her 50s, the other one is in her 20s. So I got a nice, well-rounded one. Is an educator. The oldest one, she worked in Youngstown City Schools in the 60s. The one who's in her 50s has a counseling and nursing background. The other one, she actually has a history degree from YSU. But you know, sometimes it's a little hard to get a history job type thing. So she ended up working construction. She was a flagger. And so the differences that I was able to see there, it wasn't just that whole gradual. But the interesting one, the educator, you could tell that she was really reserved. She didn't want to gossip. She didn't want to talk negative about anybody. She's like, I don't do that. But off the record, she was a little bit more open, and with me not having mentioned her name, I feel like it's safe to go ahead and just share that, you know, she would have things stolen out of her classroom, things that she needed, like a stapler, simple stuff, you know, it would come up missing. And then, or the supplies were never there for her, like if she needed more paper or if she needed more pencils or something to that extent, she would reach out and say, hey, I need this, and she would never get it. And then I guess there was a few other things as well, but one thing that she was trying to share with me is how she would go home and she would cry to her husband, you know, and it broke my heart because I don't think anybody should ever have to feel that way. When they got their education, they paid for that education, they're going to work, and she loves the kids. I mean, she said she'd get there an hour early, and I got the impression she got in there early though to use the copy. She specifically said, so she can use the copy machine early. And I'm like, because everybody else would like get in the way and never give her time to use it. But anyway, so, you know, she paid her dues, so to speak, and yet she was discriminated against. The lady, the woman that I spoke to in her 50s, it was more like comments for the most part. Other than that, though, she didn't have any major issues. And then the younger lady, actually, she might have been in her late 20s. She might be in her late 20s. But anyways, she only had one incident where she's flagging and somebody yelled out the N-word because I guess she flagged wrong maybe. I don't know what it was, but they yelled out the N-word, and her boss thankfully was like, you know what, there's nothing you can do, just shrug it off. Otherwise it's gonna affect your whole day. And as she's talking to me about it, and that was pretty much it. And she got over it very quickly. So you can see those dynamics kind of change over those 3 generations right there. So, but that's all I have. Thank you. Oh, and there's more. There's too much to say.
Our last speaker tonight is Nikki Marina.
I need my papers.
Give me this, I'm gonna take that.
Hi, everybody. So I'll be talking about the same things, but I'm gonna kind of refine my information that I share with the smaller group that I had. So she had a large overarching group, Susan's group was larger than mine, and I've done a lesser amount of interviews so far. So I've kind of tried to compile it and use a comparison method that will link it into those same things. Of the ideas mentioned so far, my set of individuals didn't necessarily express any gender pay gaps specifically. They didn't mention any instances of being, overlooked for a promotion in lieu of some man or anything specific like that. But there were some other instances that came up where maybe the influence of the supervisors wasn't very altruistic. So there was one instance wherein one of my interviewees has an experience where she requests to move locations from one government office to another government office. It's the same type of office. It's two different towns. It's basically the same thing. It's a lateral move. It's the kind of lateral move that any employee would be able to request. It's not going to cause any disruption to either office. It's not going to change the workflow in any way. It's not going to generate any real difficulties for either staff. So the level of resistance here by one male person in the hierarchy of leadership, and it wasn't necessarily overt, but it took its form in a reluctance to move the process along. Like, it seemed that he had no sense of urgency or didn't take it very seriously and really didn't pursue it on her behalf in any way that somebody in that chain of command should. So eventually this caused a delay, and the delay lasted long enough that this woman just, she filed a grievance with the union, and once she escalated it to that degree, it was quickly resolved and her actual transfer took place at that point. So sometimes it's, it wasn't an overt, obnoxious sort of man, but it was, relaxed laziness, maybe that sort of situation. So it still takes place because it obviously had no real value to him for her to make this change. And it didn't affect him at all. Like, there was no negative effect for him to help her with this. There was very little reported among my group reflecting harassment. Rather, the way these experiences were shared with me, they were framed as challenges with respect rather than outright harassment. So, for example, so a couple of women just did talk about this in a general way and then shared very specific stories with me as well. One woman reported a sort of pervasive aura of sexism just in the 70s and 80s. She used the word patronizing, and I thought that was really good. Like, that sort of patronizing mentality where we call it mansplaining today, right? So it's still, like, we still use mansplaining, we just replace patronizing with mansplaining, right? Wherein, let my manly smartness come and help your tiny female brain to understand this. I went off book there, now I'm lost. I was trying hard not to go off book. So she wasn't alone in relating that, though. Another woman reflected on a similar aspect of sexism with a reflection of like this attitude of you're just a woman, kind of what we just. But she also included that was expressed by men and women at the time. Like they were drinking the Kool-Aid in the sense that there's this sort of innate male superiority that even the women were buying into, and they were more willing to listen and ask advice of a man when the woman next to you knows just as much in this case. Or so it was interesting that she talked about that in that way, because I think that sort of innate social male superiority was so pervasive early on in the 70s and 80s. And then both of those women, and other women talked about it as well, talked about watching the social landscape change from there and watching it evolve over time, where different things took place, were socially, not just with laws, but people of both genders were looking for things to even out a little bit better. So they both talked about being able to see it from the inside and watch the bigger picture change and unfold over time, because we're talking about decades of time here. One woman specifically discussed how there was an army restructuring while she was in the army, and having experienced the military both before and after this restructuring, she was able to compare things, how things were before and after those changes. And then she also left the military and she was able to look from a really outside point of view. And she talked to me a lot about that. It gave me a great overview. She was able to describe it and encapsulate her view on it so well that it gave me a really excellent understanding of what her personal experiences were and how they fit into the larger picture and the things that she saw. She mentioned how the improvements, did continue for decades afterwards. These women who express lack of respect in the workplace seem to have a similar story of how to make adjustments that would better allow their own voices to be heard and garner more respect too. An overriding theme, I think you guys have they've both mentioned, that some of the things that people used to just put up with, some of the women, and I think maybe because we requested volunteers for this, and I think in my armchair psychological understanding of things, maybe the women that are volunteering is because they're the kind of women who also were looking for ways not to just be taken advantage of, the women that were a little more likely to stand up for themselves. And I'll be very interested to watch as we collect this information and see how much of that kind of bubbles to the top, and we'll see how it affects what we learn. But they talked about how changing the way that they express themselves would, just in their words and also in their actions, as we've heard before, it was be better than a man so you can be counted as good as a man back then and even today. And the way that you express yourself, using an I statement that says, no, I don't want you to do that, and I don't think you need to be doing that at me, instead of why are you doing that or what would make you think that. And that was something else that I had thought of before too. So I really got a lot out of this myself. Another woman I spoke to related an experience of a woman antagonizing another woman until she was provoked enough to just slap the girl, right? So somebody's needling her with her mouth, and the second girl finally just slaps her. Well, the girl who smacked the antagonizer gets immediately fired because there's no violence in the workplace. And that was just the rule. And this was, several decades ago. I think this was the late 60s when this happened. And the way the story was related to me, it was more of an interpersonal conflict than any kind of overarching disrespectful environment or anything like that. My curiosity is, it seems odd to me somewhat that there was no real injury, there was no real, it was kind of one strike and you're out. And the girl who ended up keeping her job, the one who antagonized the girl who got fired, just was never addressed by anything. So she may have been the biggest instigator ever to walk the earth. And so I thought that was interesting because I don't know if it would be any different today if somebody would actually listen or not, because I feel like there might be a little gray area there. Rather than challenges of lack of respect, what I heard over and over again was how they found a rewarding form of camaraderie also. So with my little pool of people, we have one she worked at Packard during the 60s and 70s. She reported working on a line with all other women. So her whole area was all women, and they were working together, wrapping whatever and doing the things that they do that I don't understand and probably couldn't accomplish. And she talked a lot about how they just made the best of it. They would sing and laugh and talk and make jokes and get all their work done, but make the best of their time there. Instead of kind of grousing about, oh, work is hard, they just tried their best to generate this little, I don't want to say sisterhood, because that's just too girly, but they did make the best of it and enjoy their time there and create bonds with each other, because you're spending a lot of time with these people. So I liked hearing about that. Another woman I talked to told me about getting together before work and after work with one of her coworkers to work on grants that they were pursuing on their own that were pertinent to their job, but weren't part of their job description. They just were passionate enough about, they were teachers, and they were just passionate about working with the young people and trying to get them all the things that they needed. And so they would get together and do these things outside of hours to hit their own personal goals within their workplace. And I thought that was really, I think it's really telling of the kind of people that we're talking to. Many of the women told me they remained good friends with previous coworkers long after they left that job or left that company or moved to. They stayed friends with these people, and I think that's a delightful tidbit in there too. Many women I spoke with, perhaps all, without never really saying it in so many words, I felt like I observed a little competitive streak in them, like the kind of drive to generate agency for themselves, take control of the things they could control, financially, socially, be more than the second-class citizen that some of the early times that we've talked about made them feel like other people were seeing them as. And I feel like I saw a lot of that. So we've talked about those things. We also talked a little bit about the work-life balance and childcare. So in the interviews I've done so far, very little sentiment regarding housework as a competition for paid work. I didn't hear a lot of that, like work's taking me away and I can't keep the house clean. But rather, what I did hear was childcare being the big driver. They experienced guilt over leaving their children when their children are small in an attempt to, can I do this? Can I keep working here? I want to be with my kids, but I want to have this career. And I think we've seen that universally where that just seems to come up over and over again. And the majority expressed conflicted feelings regarding not being a full-time caregiver, but when they would have a sufficient amount of support in place, some of them were able to continue working if they had a strong support structure available. When that strong support structure was lacking, they would sometimes go to part-time work, or they would elect to stay home until their children were older, if they didn't, if they just didn't feel like it was there, it just didn't feel like the right move for them. There was one that told me specifically that because of a recent move that she and her husband had made, they were in a new community, and they didn't have those deep connections in the community, they didn't have that network of people to call upon, and she said that she just didn't have faith in the, I don't want to call it commercial caregivers, but just in the people around. She didn't know them well. She didn't have faith that they would be the kind of caregivers that she would want most for her kids. So she elected to stay home until the kids went to school. And then she went back to work afterwards. All the people that I interviewed, when they did take a break like that, they did go back to work in some way afterwards. What I noticed is that these breaks in the focus of your career or your work, they did contribute in some cases to lesser wages, career stagnation, slower advancement, but kind of things that you would expect when something takes you away from your job. But conversely, for many women, this actually generated an opportunity. So for some of these women, it gave them a chance to stop and reassess and redirect and consider their interests and passions and look at it a little bit older and a little bit wiser than when they first went to work, and use that as an opportunity to make a sharp change in what they were doing with their time and their energy in order to make money. And often these women would end up in something that sounds a lot like a dream job. I talked to a lot of women who are super passionate about it. All of them reported to me a genuine passion for the work they pursued for themselves later in life, and a great deal of satisfaction because they had that opportunity. Now, not everybody had the opportunity. If you didn't have that support structure in place so that you could angle off and go, you didn't get that bigger opportunity most of the time. If you ever listen to the interviews, you can hear in their voices just how much they really enjoy what they were doing when they were able to pursue a well thought out passion. I don't even want to call it a passion project, but the job stream that they got into after they were able to kind of reassess and redirect themselves. Something else I saw too was many of the women that I interviewed pursued lifelong learning, whatever, and it was in whatever arena that may have come in. So they would return to school or get an additional degree, but it didn't have to be anything that structured. Sometimes it was additional training specific to their jobs. Sometimes it was just pursuing an interest that they really wanted to learn more about. And I felt like that was a theme that I saw, again, because my data set of women is a little bit smaller, so I saw this as a riding theme throughout the women that I talked to. As a group, they each seem to express a high level of individual drive. And I think that drive was a big part of what I was seeing. I think that's a real theme too that enabled them to make that shift. So for the group of women that I saw this sort of drive to do the best job they could do, and then when they had an opportunity to shift gears if they really wanted to, they took it into their own hands to make that change, and then they bring that drive to other avenues of their lives. One woman said at the time, she said they had a chip on their shoulder because they had worked so hard to get where they were. And when she mentioned that, she was talking about, she was actually even talking about women in nursing in what they call an expected role, right? Because nursing was still considered a women's role, more or less. And even for them, they felt like they had to work hard to prove themselves in an arena that was already considered a women's role, let alone for the many women that went into things that had been classically considered men's arenas. So I think this is it's a really excellent start to our view of some of the oral histories that we're getting. I'm finding it very interesting to see some of the commonalities and then some of the differences between both the women that I talked to myself and then some of the other reports that we have. So I'm looking very much forward to seeing how it pans out and spreads out a little bit more. I was delighted to meet and listen to all of these outstanding women. I very much enjoyed getting to know them a little bit more, and I am looking forward to, I have a bunch more to do, and I'm actually really excited about talking to more people and getting more stories, because it really is it's insightful not just to the person, but when you look at it as a whole, it's insightful to all of us. So yeah, I had a great time with this, so thank you all for listening.
Thank you. I'm just gonna have a couple of remarks to close up with. As we've seen, we're looking at a variety of different time periods, and so there's a lot of social change that's occurred as a result of that, and also some legislation. And not all of the legislation is directly pertaining to women, like the 1970 Occupational Safety and Health Act. That act allowed people to learn about the caustic agents that were in their workplace. And they had the ability to complain, and they had the ability to see what was there and what the effects would be on their health. Family and Medical Leave Act would permit people to take time off unpaid to take care of a family member, maybe a newborn, something like that, and that can benefit both men and women. We also see the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of '78 was actually part of the Disabilities Act that was around at the time, and a lot of women were able to continue working after they had their children because they weren't fired as a result of needing time off. We talked about the second shift. That's where the women are working all day at work, and then they have a second shift at home. Those responsibilities are changing over time as we see that more men are contributing to their families' well-being at home. I know in my own life, my husband does quite a bit around the house, and he doesn't see it as men's work or women's work. It's just something that needs to be done. We need to eat, so somebody has to do the grocery shopping, that kind of thing. But my colleagues have really noticed that from the baby boom generation to the millennial generation, a lot of things are changing, and so we're really excited to continue to interview people and find out what their experiences are. And then future goals. We still need a lot of women to interview. According to the grant, we need 60 women. I think we've gotten 20, 25, so we still have quite a few that we need to do. We're interested in looking at those changes over time. We're seeing a lot of similarities, but then we're seeing a lot of differences too, and new challenges that we hadn't thought about in the past, and that just didn't affect people because of technology. And we're looking at those generational trends. And we have some items that are coming up in the future. We have a workshop that's scheduled at the Vivo Center, which is part of the Ohio Living organization. This is an intergenerational workshop. We're going to get younger women together with older women and women who are retired, and allow them to talk about some key issues that they've faced. Maybe allow the older women to talk about how they dealt with issues on the job, or the younger women with maybe issues that had never come up before. On September 14th, we're going to have an opening exhibit, and we're going to have a presentation of our finding. In October, we're going to have some workshops. We have one set up with the Girl Scouts, and we have another one open to the public. Those are going to teach people how to do oral histories and do some research within their own families and anybody who's interested, really. And then our final presentation of our findings is in November. When we have the opening in September, we will also have a digital exhibit that will accompany it. So thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And if you haven't been interviewed yet, please sign up. We have information in the back. We have some sign-up sheets. We have a list of activities that are coming up. So we really appreciate your support. Thank you.
Hi, Susan.
Hi there, how are you?
If you want a guy, he's in.
I need to go
We had our.
You know what, there's a
back there. My daughter's in New York. Yes, this is Mr. Lowry. Yes. Okay. But I'm used to her. That's what I was thinking. So it's
All right, you're gonna turn it off? You can turn her off.
You
can turn her off.
Don't take that off yet.
It'll be on YouTube.
Oh, okay.